welcome back to the CCED podcast. Today, in our continued discussion of community and environmental planning, I'll be talking to Ashley Newson. Ashley is a community planner with the National Park Service Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program. In this episode, I will be interviewing her about her experiences in order to help answer our research question, what is the importance of community and environmental planning? Please enjoy the interview with Ashley Newson.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So you work for the national parks with the RTCA program. I was wondering if you could explain, like, in your experience, what the program does or is and kind of what your role in that is.
Yeah, so I've been with the program for almost 5 years. I started right before COVID. And so the RTCA program is the Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program. And those words encapsulate what the program is at the heart of it. And so the kind of projects that we work on are across the country, and we provide technical assistance in the form of planning on the projects. So we typically work at the beginning of a project or whenever it's had some kind of start or stop or change. And we provide that technical assistance to help see the project through to get a plan in place to then get implemented. And so the kind of projects that we work on are trails. So trails are the bread and butter of the program, if you will. There's a lot of different types of trail projects that we work on within that. We work on the projects that I've worked on are bicycle and pedestrian planning as well, outdoor recreation, which can encompass a lot of different kinds of things. In terms of communities wanting some kind of map of the regional assets, so looking at a bigger picture approach to it and how can they collectively leverage those assets to develop an identity and have more people come to visit or proactively manage the number of people that are currently coming. River access and water trails, a lot of my work is focused on that in the past couple of years, and the area that I'm really passionate about as well. Park planning, conservation planning, historic and cultural park, and strategic planning as well. And all of it really involves the community. That's kind of at the heart of what we do. And the projects are locally led. That is a really important piece of our program. And we kind of see where we can provide some technical assistance and resources on those. And in terms of, these are the projects that I've worked on, and it varies from person to person in the program. We have landscape architects, we have community planners, we have outdoor recreation planners, we have environmental planners. So each person is bringing their own perspective and skill sets to the positions and the projects. My background is in tourism planning and with a focus on community-led tourism planning that is also done sustainably. So I like to look at things through that lens too. Yeah.
Nice. Very cool. So with all those different kind of project types that you work on, do you find that, like, there's a huge, vastly different skill set required or different type of work required for each community you work with?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, there's some similarities in like the processes in the organizational development and the leadership, but in terms of like the technical expertise, that varies greatly from project to project. And it's something I had to come to terms with early in this role, is that there's a lot of flexibility in the kind of projects that we work on, but that also can lend itself to being like a jack of all trades, right? So like,
Yeah.
it's not going to be able to have a ton of depth in like 10 different technical areas. But if I can know a little bit about each of those, or at least kind of like start to learn about those and who I can reach out to, that can be really useful for communities. And it's also been useful to look at things through that lens that is more like holistic. So that way, when I approach projects, I don't kind of like narrow into one aspect. I'm really looking at all those. And sometimes even there might be issues that I see as an outsider that community members might not be aware of or might not see. So that can be helpful to, to voice those and kind of see what they think about that. Yeah.
Very cool. I know I've seen that kind of on site visits I've done with you and in meetings I've been in with you that you kind of do all roles for the community. I feel like you really develop a really strong relationship with community members and with project stakeholders. I was wondering, like, how do you foster that relationship? How do you make sure that trust is there when you're working with the community? Because, planning and like something changing in a community can be very daunting.
Yeah. I think what I've learned is that it's important to show up and to show up continuously and to respond quickly. It can be challenging given like everything going on, but if I can respond quickly, I think that builds that trust and keeps things moving. I think there is kind of a stereotype or a historic background of government moving slow. And so I want to not contribute to that
Yeah.
as much as I can, while also being realistic about what I can do and what I can provide. So it's a balance. And I think it takes a lot of communication. And that's something I've learned throughout the years in this job too, is being honest and open about what I can and can't do. So given my skills, my time, my background, what are some things that I can contribute to the project and what are the areas where I'm not as familiar with that, but I still am willing to learn and show up. And that's been kind of a tough lesson to learn over the time too, of managing those expectations and being honest about that and checking in throughout the project. I think that's been really powerful too, of like, what are your concerns? Am I meeting your expectations? Is this going the way that you thought it would? On some projects, when I initially get involved, I think there's a lot of interest and excitement from community members, that the National Park Service is there. I think to them it means it's a really big deal. And so I want to make sure that I'm honoring that, but also managing those expectations too, that just because the Park Service is here, that doesn't mean that I'm going to like wave a magic wand and the project's going to happen. Like it still takes a lot of effort and time on everyone's end. And I don't unfortunately come with a checkbook, so it's just for my time and my technical assistance. But I think what I have naturally that I'm really grateful for is that I genuinely am interested and care about the projects. I think I experienced that in my undergrad too, of finding my passion for the culture and the locally led things that make a place unique. I think that's where I get really excited and passionate about. And so that comes across when I meet people and I genuinely care what they have to say and I want to know about their place. And I think that builds their trust too. That I actually want to hear what they have to say and I actually want to listen.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's so important when people think about kind of planning and design and that type of role, that it is you have to, make sure people are comfortable and feel like you're meeting their needs. It's really nice. You talked about at the beginning the types of projects you worked on. And in this like kind of podcast series, we're talking about how community and environmental planning intersect. I wanted to see if you had much experience on kind of a strictly environmental planning project and kind of what your role as a community planner was in that, if you've had that experience.
Yeah. When you say environmental planning project, could you give me an example?
Yeah. So like, I guess even like recreation planning, something where it's kind of focused on environmental restoration or protection or something like that. Less focused on, I guess, the built elements of things.
Yeah. Well, I think almost all of my projects would fall into that category. I think environmental considerations are a large part of every project, and it's in balance with other interests as well too. So, and then community planning is also at the heart of it too. So I think there's a ton of overlap between the two. And I think that environmental planning done well in most cases would be community planning, so they're really are kind of one and the same, but have some differences. I think it's important to involve the community, engage with the community, and have it locally led as much as it makes sense for the environmental planning project. What I've noticed is that for some grassroots projects, there may or may not be a lot of technical knowledge on these kinds of topics. And so my role is to kind of feel that out as much as I can and see how I can support that growing. And so I think it can be really beautiful when at the end of my role in the project, the community feels like they have what they need to take it forward and that they've learned something along the way and they can do that again for another project. And so I think it's about building that capacity and the knowledge and the leaders that are able to carry things out going forward like they continue to do in the past too. And it's important too that the outcome of a project is reflective of the community. And so that inherently like requires the community to be involved throughout the process and engaged with. Trying to think of like a specific example. There's been a lot. There's been a lot of different ones.
Yeah.
A lot of my work has been like recreation focused on the projects, and then the environmental component is a really important piece to that, and it's always in balance with it too. So like you can't really do recreation planning without like environmental planning, right? Like if you want it to last, and you can't really do either of those without community planning if you want it to be enjoyable and used
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. That's good to hear, because that's kind of what we're trying to prove with this mini series is just like you can't have one without the other. You can't do environmental work without the community's involvement, and you can't, impact a community without considering their environment. So that's great to hear that in the professional field it's the same.
Yeah. I don't really see them as different. Like I kind of see it all as like the planning process. And so like you could break it down into different like niches, but really each of those niche planning fields, like they're all talking about doing it holistically. So really at the end of the day, it's all just kind of planning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's good to hear, especially because my research project's going to be it's like labeled environmental planning, but I'm trying to focus a lot on how to get the communities involved in that. And it's nice to hear that that's kind of just a requirement. It's all part of one process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And of course, like this is how like we do it in my program. And it's probably not like that across the board. It kind of depends on like who the project leads are, right? Like if it's a city, or even if it is the National Park Service itself, like they're going to have specific policies and processes of like how they go about it and do that. So the community would hopefully be involved at some points along the way. I get really excited about the projects that are like grassroots led, because that is like the community is like moving the project. And so I think it's just a really cool area to work in, and the people that I work with really care about their community. And so I love hearing their stories and their passion and their commitment, for making where they live and work better. And it's really inspiring.
Yeah. Do you find that those grassroots movements are like, do they have any big hindrances? Is there anything that kind of holds up their, impact or their process?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think a lot of them are volunteer, or it might be like a nonprofit that could be smaller. So I think just like capacity is a big one, like having the time that these kind of projects require to do it right and to do it well and to be intentional about it. So I think time is a big one. And I think like resources are another one too. These things can get expensive and it can be daunting to people too. And I think where it's worked well is when there's a lot of alignment between different groups and people, and that can really move things forward. I think if it's grassroots and the local leaders whether that be like the county or the city or an agency, if they're not aligned with the grassroots efforts or vice versa, that it's going to be very difficult, to move forward with certain pieces of the project as well. So it's beautiful when it all comes together. I think that moves things along, and yeah, that sometimes can take time to like just depending on like who's in those positions. Sometimes you just kind of have to wait it out, or there has to be some kind of trust that's built over time too.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. Well, I've asked all of my questions. Do you think there is anything else that about planning or about the RTCA program or you specifically that you'd want to talk about?
Yeah, I guess just other points I wanted to bring up is that the RTCA program, the way it framed is that we are invited into projects. That's important to it as well. And I think that helps us maybe not have some of those issues or mistrust, is that we don't go where we're not wanted, and we certainly don't force ourselves into projects. I think we really are here to provide technical assistance and support. And so if a community isn't interested in that, that's totally fine. We're not going to force that. And I haven't ran into a ton of instances where there is a lot of mistrust, but I know it's out there, and I have, experienced it before. I think there is mistrust with the federal government. And so that's something I have to kind of work through with people. And there's just also not like, they don't always understand what I do or what I'm there for. So I've learned it's important to realize that I'm an outsider in these cases, and that people don't know me, and therefore they don't trust me, which is really understandable. So I communicate with the local project leaders, and I think that's been really effective, where like if there is some kind of a workshop or event, that they're the ones who are kicking it off, and then I'm speaking for like a certain amount of time or a purpose, but that it's not like my workshop by any means. It's not my event, and it's going to be more effective if most of the communication comes from them, because that's who people know and that's who they trust. It's like something I've learned over time too, and just to listen. I find that like listening has been really powerful, and people have a lot to share kind of once you can get them like warmed up, and once they feel like they can trust you with that information. So I'm careful about what I share and repeat to others. And I also have realized too that what I'm hearing is a sliver of what's going on, and that I've got a lot to learn about the history, about the place, about the people. So it's helpful to listen and to take people's concerns serious, and to also realize that that's just one person in the community too, and that to get a better picture, I need to talk to more people and to ask questions. And so that's been helpful over time. I think there's a lot of dynamics that as an outsider, I don't always know about that. And it's helpful, to understand those as much as I can throughout the project, so that my assistance is tailored and makes sense for what's going on.
Well, that's a very, very good insight.
Yeah. And some of the things, I've learned the hard way of like managing expectations up front, right? Like I had a project partner who I thought I was meeting their expectations, and then I heard that I wasn't. And it was kind of in a way that I wouldn't expect it, or I guess it was shared with me in a forum that I didn't expect it. And so that was a hard lesson of like just checking in with project partners and asking them that question, doing as much as I can on my end, to be proactive of that, but also to recognize that it's not that stuff is going to come up, and that that's okay, and that that's a part of being a human, is that we're going to misunderstand each other. And it's important to make space for those kinds of conversations, so that our reality, can be shared, and that we're showing up authentically, and that trust is happening because we're both on the same page as much as we can be.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great.
Yeah. I guess one more thing too
Mhm.
is that one of your questions is about the planning process. Is it standard from town to town, or
Mhm.
is it vastly different? So I do like to have like from a technical side of it, there is like a technical kind of planning process. But I have noticed that there's a lot of different kinds of ones out there too. So I have that kind of in the back of my mind when I meet with community members, and then I I ask a lot of questions, I listen, I try to get up to speed as much as I can in the beginning. I, and then I I get a feel for where they're at on things, where are their skill sets, where are their gaps, and then that helps me tailor a planning process that would make sense to them. And I get a lot of input from them throughout, but I have found it varies differently from town to town, but there is kind of some standard framework in place. But in terms of like the actual process and how it plays out, that varies a lot from place to place. I like to share some kind of planning process flow chart with them at the beginning of a project. Once I feel like I've gotten a good sense for things, and that's been helpful to get feedback on that to see what they think will work, what they think won't work, how much community engagement they would like, what forms that should be in, what are some like historical contexts that they think has worked well or hasn't worked well in regards to that, and where they think some of the challenges will be at in the process so that we can know at the beginning, and that helps us work backward. For example, if there's a city council member that they know isn't as supportive of it, then that's important to know at the beginning so we can figure out some strategies or engaging with them and kind of explaining what we're working on and what we're doing so that it's not a surprise
Yeah.
at some point.
Yeah. That's probably very good. I think that surprise is probably where a lot of that mistrust comes from too, of just not
Yeah.
having clear communication and kind of throwing things at communities without, talking to them about it first.
Mhm. Yeah, and it seems like there's always a surprise, whether it's big or small, at some point in
Mhm.
like the project, and you try your best to communicate and be strategic about the communications and who you communicate to and when,
Mhm.
especially to like landowners or groups that are concerned about these kinds of topics. Like you want to be strategic about that and have a lot of the information available. So when they come with questions, like you can answer those. Yeah. And so um, you learn from mistakes, and you learn from others' mistakes and see what works and what doesn't work. And again, it's all like a part of the human condition, right? So like I think that's something over time I've had to be like, okay, there's going to be mistakes, and that's okay. Like trying out new things, that happens with that. And so
Yeah.
you just hope that people are still open to hearing and open to learning.
Yeah. I'm glad we circled back to those because I think that's really good. That's really good to hear. Good information to have.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for chatting about this because this isn't only like helpful for the podcast. This is very nice for me to hear kind of real experience and, practical application of everything. So,
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yeah. I love to talk about it, and I could talk about it all day with you.
yeah.
Yeah. It's a really meaningful field, to work in. I'd be happy to talk about it again
Mhm.
with you anytime.
Thank you to Ashley for being on this episode of the CCD podcast. It was so wonderful to get her insights on the planning process in the RTCA program. Thanks again to Ashley, and thank you for listening to this episode. Tune in to our third episode for our discussion of community and environmental planning, where Colby and I are going to discuss our personal experiences with the planning process and our final thoughts on the topic for the moment. Thank you.